So it doesn't make.
Sorry, we are back or not?
We are, sorry,
Yeah.
yes.
Right, then the inquiry is resumed. Mr. Harris, please introduce.
Can I call evidence chief of Dr. Chris Mealy, please, sir? His qualifications and experience is set out at pages 8 and 9 of his main proof. I can ask the lady to take this right.
Please do.
Dr. Mealy gives evidence of his Westminster instructions, which you might not be so familiar with, in paragraph 109. So I'll ask him just to say a little about his Westminster experience beyond that you will already be familiar with.
Thank you. So just to assist you, I've been working in Westminster for more than 30 years now. First as an English heritage officer, doing listing work and also supporting casework and advising the City Council and indeed advocates. And then from 1998 in private practice, I think it's fair to say it's the authority I've done with regard to more private instructions than any other. Advised the City Council itself on the preparation of conservation area audits some time ago now, but more recently, my firm and I've been part of the teams have been advising the City Council on developments in Churchill Gardens Conservation Area, which is council-owned estate, and also Lisson Grove in the north part of the borough, and that's related to a number of instructions on discharge estate regeneration. I'm particularly proud of a number of special projects I've done in Westminster. Recent ones include the redevelopment of the Royal College of Surgeons site in Leamington Field, with new Armamentarium Museum, in a grade 2 behind a grade 2-star facade. The Dean and Chapter of Westminster Abbey, the Solarium project, which if you don't know it, I recommend it. It's a sort of visitors cafe and center of vaulted space. I had all the planning commissions and shared one sense for that. So I draw attention to my advice to the Secretary of State on the National Holocaust Memorial and Learning Center, and advised the National Gallery on many smaller state planning things over the years, and also served the Illuminated Rivers project with the Rothschild Foundation, where again I got all the planning permissions and building consents to do an artistic illumination of 15 bridges in the centre of London and obviously a number of Westminster. And if you go at night time around the Houses of Parliament, you see very interesting and subtle illuminations. I've done all manner of developments in Westminster over the years, small scale, high value residential projects involving listed buildings, larger residential projects in Queensland's Gate, for example, involving this shouldn't think about 10 facades. Theatre work, we do all the theatres for Double at Macintosh in the West End. Done a number of hotels. The one I think I'm proudest of is the Bow Street Hotel in Covent Garden. It's been trading a few years now. Very interesting it is too. And so I feel I know the city very well. I have been fortunate really to work on a number of very significant retail projects. So I've given advice on the House of Fraser building, the Evans building, although that instruction was discharged by one of my partners, I gave initial advice on it. And also high-end, I switch to call high-end retail, sir, in the Bond Street area. So the Xenia redevelopment, which involved demolition of 2 buildings in the conservation area, as well as the Richard Green Gallery, which is a wonderful new classical building. It's won a Georgian Group Prize. I'm very proud of that. As well as Burlington Arcade, where I've been advising for many years, including on a very attractive marble floor, which you think might be easy to get consent for, but it wasn't. But so anyway, I feel I have a good feel for the borough overall and retail as well. So I hope that's helpful to you. Thank you so much for coming for a moment.
Thank you very much. And I think you need to declare involvement with Selfridges.
Yes, so my firm advises Selfridges on all planning and listed building consent matters. I do not, however, take part in the discharge of that instruction. I have no knowledge of it. It's done and overseen by my partner, Mr. Bransfield, who's head of our London planning team. So it's right that I declare that.
Good. Thank you very much for that. I want you to say something really briefly, please, about the nature of your role and involvement in this case.
So I was first approached through Mr. Filbert originally, must have been in September 2018, and invited to get involved in the project. We put a proposal to the applicant, which was accepted sometime in October. I took part in the very initial appraisal of some of the potential viewpoints that were going to be engaged by proposals. But then the instruction to I just for internal reasons passed to a partner of mine who completed the work, and I had no role in although I had no role in completing the HTBIA, but I was periodically kept up to date with what was going on as much sort of interest as anything else, because of my familiarity with the site. And it should also be said, sir, that my partner, Dr. Bowdler, who is a specialist in listing matters previously with that work, Historic England, he oversaw the certificate of immunity. And I was consulted just briefly to over that internally. But so after that initial involvement, there's very little to deep dive in the music project. And sir, it's fair to say that the applicant came to me, at the time of the calling, really, and asked whether or not I would give evidence in support of the proposals. I was not familiar with the detail of them at that point, so I had to review them. I paid an external site visit. I didn't do an internal site visit because I had already been throughout the whole back in 2018. I think was the first thing we did, to take a full site view. And there being a roof, for example.
The desktop is slightly different to the.
That's one part of business, but that's not exactly what we're doing.
Wait a minute.
Yeah,
We're using shit.
yeah. So that, I mean, that involves, and sir, I think I think in fairness, I've done calling before, and the applicant wanted that, and through that experience, so that's how I got involved in that.
Thank you very much. There's a heading in your proof entitled policy considerations. Unless you wish us to, sir, I am not going to go through policy with this witness. In which case you produced a presentation based on the inspector's main issues relevant to you that you'd like to present to the inquiry. Is that right?
That's correct, and sir, you have it. I think it's been submitted digitally, and I have a hard copy. I'm not very good at quality copy, but you can take it away. But I'm going to canter through that now, and being familiar with the rules, everything in here is before you already, either from the HTBIA or evidence or elsewhere. There are a couple of slides where I should say my colleague has marked up the slide just to assist with identification. And I'll point those out to you, but I've run those past Mr. Fraser and his note. So it is all as you expect. So I would just like, sir, to start with just a little bit about the site and its context. And to do that, I show you a heritage asset plan that we prepared and is part of the HTBIA, and which I reproduce in my evidence, which contains, identifies all of the designated assets. And so we don't, sir, identify the non-designated heritage assets in conservation areas, and that, sir, is done in the body of the HTBIA, which is basically the photographs and so forth. And I say first that this is based on a very comprehensive analysis of the wider area. And a number of the assets were not specifically assessed in the HTBIA, but that was by agreement, I understand, with the local authority. And that really is just to try to streamline the documentation and so forth. The point has been made now, I think, sir, several times, obviously, that the site itself, which you see highlighted there, is not part of any conservation area. And you've heard different figures from banded around about how much of Westminster is in the conservation area, a great deal of it. And so what I thought would be helpful, sir, would be.
I think it's agreed that the half the bridge is.
I beg your pardon. Yes, that's right. Just, yes, so half the bridge is correct.
But it's correct.
Yeah. So either the boundary should be on the line of Heston, or it's just the sort of the thickness of the pen that's put it in. That's acknowledged. I think it's really a setting consideration in relation to the stage. I think it's fair to say. I thought it would be helpful to contextualize this plan with reference to another one that's in front of the inquiry, which we haven't looked at, CD 605. Mr. Pilber in his evidence does reference this document, which is recent, understands an SPD, it's Oxford Street Place Strategy Delivery Plan. And the reason I show it, sir, is it shows it slightly faint wash, but I hope you can make out a sort of light brown, how much of Oxford Street is and isn't in a conservation area between Tottenham Court Road and Marble Arch. And the simple takeaway from this is there are very few sites in Oxford Street as a whole that aren't in a conservation area. And there's a slight, I think, it's a paradox, maybe, or an irony, or maybe neither, but it is one of those things that the most sustainable parts of Westminster, the southern half generally, are the ones also subject to some of the most significant designations within the city council plan area. And I just make the point as both a planner and as a specialist working in this area, I know that that means such sites are particularly important to optimize. They're not very common, and to get involved with a site, as the Tilbury House that we did, which is such a large extent in that area, is a pretty unusual experience in one ownership, and I think that does need to be borne in mind. We'll look, sir, a little bit later at some of the department stores slightly further along Oxford Street. There's a Debenhams which is not in, and then there's the Evans store which is in Harley Street. But we'll come back to that shortly, just setting the scene a little bit for that. I thought then I would look, sir, at the historical development of the site. I mean, we've heard a lot about the buildings. They've been described variously, but I thought I would extract from some of the information for the inquiry some information that I thought was relevant and that I'd invite you to note and Secretary of State to consider. I think, sir, as a starter, it is extremely fortunate that the inquiry has recently published a volume of the Survey of London, volume 53, which deals with all the sites that we're looking at now, including the west end of Oxford Street as a generality, but also both Selfridge's site and the site that we're talking about. And for your notes, sir, we don't need to go there. The Selfridge's site is CD 6.45. And I think if you read one thing closely of all material, it's the most interesting and entertaining, really, and worthwhile. And then 6.49, you'll have to find some mention of the west part of Oxford Street, including Park House. And then finally, Orchard House and the site is dealt with at CD 6.46. We wanted, sir, to try to get a hard copy of the survey volume to you, but sold out, which is kind of surprising. And we would otherwise have done that because it's difficult. We only managed to find some PDFs on the way related, so they don't have this first time. Apologies, just couldn't get it from thing. So the site, sir, is what I'd like to do is just draw out some of those main points, and always bearing in mind that whilst a lot of my topic area and Mr. Forshaws, and one of the main issues is obviously on Orchard House. We are talking about a site which comprises 3 buildings, obviously. We just haven't seen them, but just to set the stage there, identified for you. And I just wanted to take a little walk around the site. In a sense, starting slightly oddly, sir, with the only building on the site that was actually built by Marks and Spencers for themselves, which is designed and built 1968 to 1970 by Lewis and Hickey, who, as I understand, were their kind of in-house, were the regularly retained firm. And it's important, sir, to associate the construction of this with the widening of Orchard Street that we've heard about already, but also maybe something you haven't heard about, the connection that was made in the 1970s between Granville Place and Portland News. There's a little L plan connection that is where the loading bay is. That's at the back of this site, and that to make that an access, the end of the terrace was demolished. So this was a building that had quite a significant impact on the historic environment. I think until exchange of evidence, I don't think any party had identified any particular value in this building. I'll just quote to you what the survey says about it. It's quoted, says, a large and utilitarian steel frame structure with an austere front clad in Portland stone. And that is in the survey volume, in the one dedicated to the site and its surrounds. And it comprised some sales floor space, some staff quarters, staff welfare facilities, and a cafe, which we did see on our side. And I think that apart from these observations about its utilitarian nature and quality, I mean, it's very much of its time. Not a good example of this kind of architecture from that time. I think the features that stand out to me as sort of intrusive are just the lack of relief in the facade, this attempt at the first floor level to make some sort of pattern, the sort of recessed thing seems very, very badly handled. And obviously, sir, it's insensitive to Hesketh House because it butts right against it, and you saw that, Sean, too. And then there is that projecting canopy, which sort of oversells the pavement. It's not a very nice space at all. But again, it's unusual in the sense that it's the only building on this site that's actually constructed Marks and Spencer. And then there's Neil House there, which obviously, again, was not constructed for Marks and Spencer. I'll talk about the history of occupation shortly, but a building which, well, yes, of its time, I think there's probably broad agreement, or might be, that it's a very poor piece of architectural design, and for a number of reasons. First of all, it makes nothing contextual about it. And this use of brick slips, I mean, I can't give any other instance in the surrounding area. You find some of this in Chinatown, Shaftesbury Avenue from about the same period of time, and it was a sort of favorite treatment. But I mean, the lack of scale and the detail and lack of any attempt to relate to building datum around it, and indeed it's recessed from the building one at Orchard House, which you will have noticed. No cornice, no decent entablature. I mean, okay, it's this kind of architecture doesn't have it, but it's a very poor reflection of basic architectural principles and very poor shot front of its condition. And I think harmful to the all of the heritage assets and the visual meaning of the area we're talking about. And on the site, we walked around the site. I think the images speak for themselves, really, as part of the 1970s and mid-1980s extension, a kind of hodgepodge, like eclectic collections of buildings at the rear, dead frontages. It's just which is unfortunate, really, given it's in the port. It abuts the Portland State Conservation Area, but it's also in the setting of the called the Sussex Hotel, which is that really attractive Italianate terrace that we'll look at shortly in the song. So, in many respects, in the summary, the site strongly detracts from the visual amenity and the townscape of the area. And I think if, as a whole looked at, I think that is the conclusion I would invite you to consider as a big juror. One of the real opposite points of emphasis is Orchard House, and we've heard some information about that already. Mr. Pilbara earlier showed you a slide that indicated the removals that had taken place. So I won't re-show that slide, but you saw sort of balconies between the first and second floor level that have been shorn off. These little Anthemian moldings in the end bays you see piercing the skyline just of the attic story have been removed. Sculpture has been removed. And of course, shop fronts and the whole ground floor of the building on the Orchard Street side has been taken back. So those are the principal alterations to the building. So, architecturally, I write a fair bit about this in my evidence. I think, in a sense, I'll start with what the survey says again, which is its quote, and this is CD 646 for your notes there. Orthodox stone-faced classicism common to major London buildings of its type and time. So orthodox stone-faced classicism common to major London buildings of its type and its time, which is not a strong write-up. We reproduced in both the HTBIA and my evidence there some other examples, but the City Council, I think, has done a very good job in its statement. And I just commend to you the appendices in CD 8.01, again for your note, where I think it's Mr. Pendleton has put into evidence images of office buildings in central London from an earlier period. I don't have any slides that illustrate this, but for example, and in these, I don't know if you can get it to hand. I don't know. Yeah. CD 801.
Appendix 2, I think.
Yes, that's right. And Mr. Pendleton has through numbered his appendices. So paper copy, page 100. I'm working off, which is in the lower left.
I'm happy to hold mine for.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. And it's, I mean, it starts with Eels, maybe an unfair comparison. It's a very distinguished and listed building. In fact, I've advised on various alterations to Eels over the years, so not even to the Westminster. But I think it demonstrates really, we'll come to Selfridges in a minute, but it demonstrates really the level of sophistication that was achieved in certain works of commercial architecture of the period. I think both as to the refinement of proportions, the rhythm that you see in the facade, the relief, and the fineness of detailing too, and in particular the case of Hughes, the use of inset metal detailing, which is very sophisticated, subtle and elegant. And even the use of sort of non-standard metal glazing, you see for the almost like this sort of Georgian glazing pattern in the other parts. So very sophisticated stuff. And then what happens after the First World War is that all of that kind of that classical approach to the design of buildings, basement, top, appeared elevation, bigger windows, metal inset becomes absolutely common. And there are just dozens, more than that, examples of buildings of very similar in nature to Orchard House. It's just not special in terms of what you find in Westminster from this period at all. And in some ways, sir, it's kind of old-fashioned. But even leaving that to one side, I don't think it's an accomplished piece of architecture. And I'll just make a few observations and drawing on my written evidence. And we'll see some of this a little bit later, sir, but there's very little depth of relief in the facade between on the first, second, and third floors. And so if you look at the way the pilaster sits in relation to the wall plane below it, there's a kind of frame that unites the first, second, and third floors. It's a sort of trick of architecture, is bringing these floors together. But there's no relief in depth between those pilasters and that frame. And a lot of the relief in the ornament is very shallow indeed. Even in the original state, the shop front entablature was, of the simplest. And in the evidence, sir, I say most economical. And then, sir, for some reason, don't know why particularly, the fourth floor has this recess. And the Ionic columns stand out, I think, kind of incongruously. And as a consequence, the pilaster doesn't really seem to have the visual integrity that you get on the good examples of this style of architecture. The cornice is not elaborate, absolutely standard moldings without any sophistication. There are these, I just think, kind of unusual horizontal details in the fourth floor, which is that course that you have the Ionic columns are. And then finally, sir, I think the thing that really tells against this building is the heaviness of the attic story. There's got no relief in it. As if I think the architect is wanting the eye to stop at the entablature and not notice the top. It's very crudely detailed. And the attempt to relieve it by an anthemian is, I think, it's a bit of a sticking plaster ribbon. So it's, and finally, I just bear in mind that there's a number of architectural professionals addressed to you this. And a point was made, I can't remember the gentleman's name, I apologize, about a building that turns the corner well, doesn't turn the corner well enough in this. I mean, what the architect has done is he's recessed the corner bay marginally, and it's what you'll recognize as what's called an every entry corner. And there's no relief in it, it's very flat. So I don't think it in any way really celebrates the corner or brings the building to a stop. In fact, there's just these narrow windows. But it is what it is. It's speculatively built office building from the 1920s, as the late 1920s, as the survey says. Typical, and in fact, I think in some ways, you know, not very good, not very good at all as an example. So I think then, sir, how does Marks and Spencer tell me about the history of this building? As I'll talk about shortly, the Portman estate begins to grant, well, the Portman estate begins to suffer death duty requirements at the end, after the First World War. And they begin to give leases to development, but that's so forth, Portland land. And this plot is let, the legals on it from 1923, but then there are plans from 1928. And this plot and all the land to the west over to Edgware Road is developed by, the Lions Company, which you'll know them, once a household name, and done as an investment. All of those offices. Now, interestingly, sir, neither the estate nor Lions specified any architectural uniformity at all. There were no guidelines in the way that there were for Kingsway, and that was developed, or obviously Regent Street for the Crown, where there were plenty of guidelines. And that's why you have the uniformity. And so the variety and form you get at the west end of Oxford Street, well, all across Oxford Street at this end, is a consequence of the approach taken to development and the scale of the plots too. They all come pretty good. I mean, the one unusual thing about this is the inclusion of those Alice in Wonderland sculptures. Absolutely no explanation for that. I mean, so the building is built on spec with a bank at the corner, and Lions taking the upper 3 floors. And about midway through construction, M&S decided it would like a presence on Oxford Street. It had been based in Southwark. It wanted something in the West End. By this point, sir, the dry goods and drapery businesses are well established in Oxford Street. Overall, and so they move in and they take only, well, they take a large part of the ground floor, interestingly, they take the basement. But then what happens is interesting, sir. It's a bit of a metaphor almost, that's the right word for the site, because they gradually begin to take more space. First one floor, then another. And by the 1960s, they get control of the whole building. And I think that's when they knock the balconies off and put the M&S insignia in the area that's left here. And that's also when, in the late 60s, they decide they need to expand and decommission. It becomes their largest store. And then in the 70s, starting in the 70s, right through the 90s, they begin to open up more sales floors in the buildings and then eventually expand into the houses we've seen. So, Mr. Pilbara earlier talked about, the we call it uneven, varied nature of the interior, complete reflection of the way Marks and Spencer is grown up on the site. I mean, there's never been a clear plan for the organization of this building. It's been a series of expedient decisions, understandable, because that's the way retail is quite often, in my experience, in response to the success of this store, outstripping the success of the Pantheon, which is a purpose-built store. So when you go to that, it's a very attractive building with polished black granite facing. And the style of that building was basically M&S's house style. It's got a really flush, elegant, sort of pilastered facade. And many places you go in the country, and I've worked on a number of these stores, you see simplified versions of that. So it was their livery. And it's dignified on Oxford Street because of polished granite. The building, as I say in evidence, sir, does have certain affinities with Selfridges, and I think that's accepted. I mean, obviously, it's an old building, but it comes later. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that the designers of this building or should have were in any way thinking to reflect the design of Selfridges. Now, I might be asked, oh, well, there's an ionic order used. But actually, the ionic order, sir, is what you find across commercial buildings all over the West End. It's, Corinthian and possibly would be too fancy, right? Those are sort of dignified palaces, churches, and so forth. And, Doric and Tuscan would be too military. I mean, it's sort of civic but commercial order. And that's why you find the mirror. It's not anything special. There's no detailing. And, I mean, the corners don't even terminate in the same way. Mr. Pilbara referred to Vernon's definite stacked square pillar on the corner of Selfridges and the sort of weak corner feature on the other side. The cornice carries across between the two, and that's a point of convergence. And they have both important stone, and they have this recessed metal glazing. But again, absolutely standard. It's exactly what you'd expect to be done on this site. So there is an affinity to it. And you see on the right-hand side, actually, some of the detailing of the building, which I think is particularly thin. And in the end, sir, we've concluded in the HDBA, I agree, I do so in evidence, it's sort of parsimonious, the building, I think. There's a stair. I didn't mention that in my evidence. Mr. Forsher put it into his rebuttal. I must have seen the stair when I first visited the site in 2018, but I just couldn't recall it. I didn't make another site view internally for this evidence, so I did externally. The stairs there is much like the outside of the building. It's an accommodation stair, typical for office buildings of this period. The stair bay is efficient in its layout. There's no spatial interest in the lobby. And the railings are fairly standard. And as is the time, for that matter. There's no scheme of decoration or any sort of spatial elaboration in the plan. It's absolutely ordinary. We come then, sir, to the interest of the architectural practice Traherne and Norman, founded in 1900, still going, actually, and I've done projects with them. They're smaller than they were, I think, after the war. Well known for doing commercial offices from about 1900. In fact, Thomas Tate, who was working on the Flocker's building for a time, wound up transferring practices to Traherne and Norman before setting up on his own. It's very important. And it's thought that Africa House, which is one of their buildings at Kingsway, and is period too, is possibly his work. But of course, here you're dealing with a building of an entirely different order in terms of its structural elaboration and its architectural ambition, and rightly listed for those two reasons. And as part of a planned ensemble, which is the Kingsway, this is a very strong group. I think how to characterize them, sir, I'd say they were a highly competent, successful commercial practice. Another practices founded at this time, T.P. Bennett, again, still trading, I worked with them, emerged at this period of time. Carrying right through the war into the present day firm that's gone, Gunton and Gunton again. There are many firms active in London at this point doing exactly this sort of work. So overall, sir, I think that the building doesn't, its historical interest, sir, is limited. It certainly reflects a certain phase of office development in London. Traherne and Norman is recognized by experts as a solid commercial firm. Historically not particularly significant. They really come up in the history of British architecture as you study it. And the design of the building typical as well. Now, early in the process, early in the process, sir, we agreed with Westminster City Council. But notwithstanding all that, we could be highly critical of the building. It's come in the central focus of the discussion that it had sufficient interest because of its age and its materials to warrant identification as a non-designated heritage asset. And, so Westminster doesn't contain a local list. They do these things on a case-by-case basis. And so, obviously, not a designated asset. And within that category of NDHA, I think probably want to point quite limited interest to. It's not a building, sir, that in my view adds anything to an appreciation of Selfridge's historic and technical modern, except possibly for the reasons Pepsi have identified, which are entirely negative. Because the contrast between the character and style and craftsmanship in Orchard House and Selfridge's is so great that it only magnifies in my estimation anyway, the brilliance of Selfridge's. So highly specific, bespoke, premier project on the one hand for Selfridge's and ordinary commercial office product on the other. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the proposals, but not at length. And I just want to put up a few slides that sort of highlight some of the points that then feature a little bit of my analysis. That was lots of information from Mr. Bilborough. The points that have been made are ones that I invite you to consider: the division of the ground plane in this way, the active frontages, the creation of a place at the rear, removal of loading bay, landscape features. All I think are things, the plans, the generator, and all highly commendable, I think, and a massive improvement over what's there at the moment. Mr. Bilborough showed his slides that sort of elevate the cores to the elevations and so to speak, largely dead frontage. I think quite important, sir, are some of those places, character areas at the main entrances that create sort of legibility in the form of the building, a sense of orientation. And sir, I think this is a page for Mr. Bilborough's evidence. I've just looked at it, but I think it's quite helpful because to show that the Burnham designed entrance to Selfridges there, sort of large, sort of void at the center of the facade with the wonderful sculpture that marks it. It's obviously the focal point, but it does put me in mind, sir, of the, well, it's been called the cleft, but I mean, the way the elevations angle in towards the entrance, I think give it a sufficient, in a sense, a similar presence and identity, which I think is important here, sir, because not, as we know, M&S is not taking the majority floor space in this building, and yet they want it to be their flagship store. So the entrance to the M&S has to have a certain presence and I think scale in order to announce themselves as sort of British household name. On our most important, should be our most important high street. And then finally, sir, a slide in the middle. I'll come back to these, which demonstrate, or just as a placeholder, as much as anything else, demonstrate the increase in public realm. So I think it might look small on a plan, but I think it punches above its weight in terms of the actual impact it had. I think slide Mr. Bilborough didn't show you in his presentation, certainly in his proof and in the DAS. And so I think you did ask a question about your central entrance versus entrance side here, but I think very helpful for illustrating first the organizing principles of the facade of the proposals and how Mr. Bilborough and the team have tried to give it a clear sense of horizontal hierarchy that picks up on some of the dimensions of the building of the Selfridges facade, which is the most important influence in this area, in the building area. But also, sir, to make the point about scale as a function of grain and length. So I think the figures are in Mr. Bilborough's rebuttal. The overall length of the Selfridges facade is about 154 meters, thereabouts. The facade on Oxford Street is about half that. And then that length is again broken down. And I think overall about 70, or maybe 78 meters, I think is the figure, but it's sort of 75 meters. It's interesting. So because scale and scale relationships, sir, are not just about, as you know, sorry to put in this term, but it's not just about height and depth. It's also about length of grain. And I think that these are important considerations. And I know, and Mr. Bilborough has given evidence of, the team was concerned and working with Westminster to try to avoid anything that was going to be over dominant Selfridges. And I think the other point that this slide makes is it illustrates very neatly the way the architectural idea does enable differences in height to be negotiated locally. So the West Hand component, which is a story higher than the eastern component, which relates to Selfridges. I think because of the cleft in the facade, as we'll see in the very of the facade, you don't really notice the differences, which I think is quite a skillful aspect of the design. So again, not much detail. Again, a placeholder, Mr. Bilborough's proof. This is a very interesting case, sir, where the City Council set out its own, what it thought an appropriate massing would be on the basis of its own model exercise. And there was an iterative process that took place, which actually led to more development being identified as suitable on the top of the building. than what either the applicant potentially or the city council had first thought. And I think it's a very good illustration of the way design optimization should work. And I just reflect on my own experience so that now that we have all the digital modeling, it's very easy to stop the site, to take advantage of sightlines and interposing development, actually to get, well, call it an optimal amount of mass, but therefore the maximum without causing any harm to surrounding areas. And this is a very good illustration of the way that happened. Mr. Pilbara referred to a very exhaustive process or intensive process that is the proof documents. There were 11 meetings over 2 years with the city council, which is quite a number in my experience. And it shows the level of engagement. I didn't take part in those meetings. I can't attest to them, but I mean, clearly it led to a strong recommendation from the city council officers. A few more words on the proposal. So you highlighted this image, the translucent thing. I hadn't interpreted it that way because it does sort of include the setback story, but for whatever reason, I show this slide only because I think there's something about a line weight drawing, which captures better than a photograph sometimes some of the essential characteristics that you want. But I think it's worth thinking about when you're looking at buildings in context. First of all, about Selfridges, I think it really demonstrates the power and scale of the giant order. They're nearly detached ionic columns. It's a great sense of relief. And the fineness of the column detailing and the elaborate nature of the entablature and cornice with these escutcheons and projecting frames, incredibly refined and complex work of ornament throughout, but culminating in the attic story entablature. And so for that reason, sir, I think it's right that the design does seek to respond to that. Not in a way to defer it, but actually to continue it. So to do something which is something you notice. The current cornice at the moment, it's inside we'll see it, there's no horizontal across it. The other thing to bear in mind, sir, or that this drawing makes me think about, is the difference in scale module of design. So again, monumental order spanning 3 floors on a base, a really chunky, elaborate top. And then what you have is a very fine facade that contrasts with that. And that fineness comes, as we'll see, not just from the Portland stone and brick piers and ribs, but also from those inset metal panels. Mr. Pilbara explained have been adjusted so to get some shading and so forth, which adds, together with the depth of the ribs, a real richness and variety in the facade. Just very interesting. It would be, that's what having constructed a very, I think, engrossing and highly articulated building. And Mr. Pilbara explained to you, he showed you the slides, sir, his evidence from its 1753, that image of the period hut, treatise on architecture. And it's sort of the beginning of all thinking in the modern period about classicism and modernity. It's about reducing architecture to its constituent parts, support, enclosure, ornament, all of the basics. And I mean, that's what Selfridges was. That was what Burnham was trying to do. He was completely immersed in that tradition of what I think it's an architectural story that we call Post-Rationalism, which is the expression of structure as the basis for architectural appearance and expression. And this building, not just in terms of the projecting cornice, and that connection with timber architecture and so forth that Mr. Pilbara has spoken about, but also in the use of functional components, solar shading, to generate a grain, I think puts that building in that structural rationalist tradition. Now, a lot of modern buildings are, but I think interestingly here they're integrated into the whole image, and I think in a very satisfactory way. And so you have a sort of dialogue across these two buildings around ideas of expression of structure, which I think is does add to the depth and quality of the architectural design. An aerial view, sir, just to make one point, and simply that you're talking about the setback forward, indeed it is setback, but also in the quite sensitive southern elevation, it's setback and staggered and simulated. And of course, when we look at the two-dimensional images, you know, one can't appreciate the degree of relief that there would be as a consequence of that, which then would be added to by fineness of detail in the greenery. Spoke about. And it's interesting, this building, sir, because it does Orchard Street and North Audley Street. It's one street that connects to London's great garden squares. There's obviously greenery at either end of the journey and really nice street trees we saw the north end of North Audley Street. And obviously the proposal does that. And in the context of a managed office environment, we occupy one of these kinds of offices in the city now. There, you know, that greenery and landscape is a real feature that people want and is maintained as part of an office scheme. So there is I think that for policy reasons, there's urban greening, obviously, but also there is a sort of contextual response, I think, which adds to the richness of the design. I referred earlier, sir, to that change in the carriageway width, and I'm not going to comment on dimensions or anything like that, but just in terms of, you know, the obvious before and after. At the moment, from the west side of Orchard Street, and Selfridge's returns, the original building returns about 7 or 8, maybe 9 bays on that side. You can't really appreciate the detailing in Selfridge's very well because the colonnade gets in your way, the general busyness. And the building actually provides more area from which to admire Selfridge's, as well as this being a clear public realm. And I want to show you the other slides, but Mr. Tilborough showed this earlier. Again, apologies for the same image, but what I want to make here is slightly different. It's a particularly good place to see the way in which the new public realm would improve the viewing experience of Selfridge's. But also, a point I'll touch on a little bit later, removing the Harlan canopy. There is a certain monumentality and scale to the lower parts of this building proposals. The product of the not overselling, the express cornice, the product of the solid masonry construction, the use of, you know, noble materials, Roman brick and Portland stone, which I think actually makes you more aware of the classicism of Selfridge's. And so the whole interaction across Orchard Street becomes more cohesive as an architectural and soundscape experience. And I think I'll explain, summarize all of it.
Just pause there. So that's the proposals, the existing buildings and the general environs. You're now, I think, going to whip through very quickly. So maybe bearing in mind that what happened on the site yesterday.
Yes.
And I can't comment that Montague Evans are now occupying the building that you explained.
Yes.
Characterised by the inspector once as the can of harm. That's the building that Dr. Mealy now lives in.
I didn't characterize it. I quoted others.
You did quote others, yes, but maybe with approbation.
Very nice office buildings, actually. Anyway, so we've looked at these 2 points, so I will be brief, but I'll make some short points because in a sense I've set up some of my comments already, so we can just follow in there quickly. I hope it's quite a good image of the Orchard House. I'm just adding some of the detail. Sir, I think this slide makes me just want to comment about something that has been put into the evidence, and certainly historic England. They call the building striped, I think. And look at, and I say there's no getting away from this. This is a, you know, definite statement, and it's a strong building. But a strong building in the setting of another strong building does not mean either one or the other is diminished in the way you appreciate it, because in really interesting, historically and visually rich urban environments, there are lots of good buildings next to one another. And that's part of your experience of great cities. And I think this is one of them, really. And I'll make a few more points as we move along. So coming up North Audley Street, sir, slide enables me to, I think, reinforce the point about the heaviness of the cornice on Orchard House. It's slightly ungainly, but it's man view. And also, I think, sir, by reason of the Park House, whatever you think about it, I know it divides opinions. It's a building which definitely marks the end of Mayfair and the beginning of Oxford Street. Because there's a change in scale, there's a change in material, there's a change in character. Which it announces as you get close to the corner, which the current building continues, but which the proposals would then develop and pick up on. This slide is very useful, sir, for demonstrating the relative scale relationships on height as well, and also the reinforcement of materials palette across Oxford Street. Of course, the existing building does that. I mentioned, sir, that the west end of Oxford Street is characterized by some big buildings, and there are some big buildings. The Bernard St. Lawrence named Royal House. It was excuse my mind. Yeah, thank you. So a whole urban block, slightly lower than the proposed building, but of a considerable scale in monumentality because of the continuity of surface and the curved corners and the strength of that. And sir, I think we all saw yesterday the way in which this building and other buildings really does affect your experience of the lower buildings to the north of this. And so just a simple point in the context of Oxford Street and these long oblique views, this is as proposed. There's no real interruption of the cornice line or the sense of enclosure. And if anything, sir, the proposal to close the street, the two new buildings here from this point better than the existing building. Shot, sir, we did look at, I mean, it's not just that the cornice and the tablature on Orchard House is a sort of weak feature, but then of course is the change in upper floor building line as the setback, the change in materials, and the break in the cornice line, all of which I think contribute to the intrusive character of this building in its setting. I think a really interesting image, and that was one that, you know, you will reflect on very carefully. I certainly have. Is, and what does it mean? The really important thing, I think, is the continuity of a few important things in relation to Selfridges and the general townscape. The Oxford Street over the years hasn't really had too much coherence. You know, it's characterized by variety. It's part of the joy of it, I suppose. Some people find that slightly irritating. No, I mean, it's change and there's difference, and that's what it is. It's not Regent Street, it's not Kingsway. But one of the advantages of this building is it creates a sort of continuity of color palette across quite a long frontage, and I think does help to calm it down a bit and introduce a certain elegance to the whole experience. Now, the elevation of the projecting cornice is a strong feature. It reinforces the horizontality and the long line of the street. And the scale and proportions, particularly of the eastmost element, have a kind of, there's a real complementarity between the proportions of that angling element and the scale and proportions of Selfridges, as you appreciate here. And this is another one of those images which I think demonstrates why. There's actually an enhancement to the setting of Selfridges, because the development makes a more cohesive and continuous townscape, apart from introducing a building of just vastly superior architectural quality, care and attention to detail, materials, and so forth. So it moves from being a site with just standard office product to a really carefully considered bespoke design. And I think similar points can be made in the other direction. And so I think this image is a little simply capture, I think, some of the finest of the detailing of the proposals, which is why I started with the pen and ink drawing, actually. But I think it does make the point equally well about the continuity of cornice. When I first looked at this scheme, I really thought a lot about whether or to what extent the angling in of the facades was intrusive. And I don't think it is, because I think the cornice is such a strong feature, a really strong and dramatic feature, that it defines the building image, and that what the inflection or the cleft does is it introduces some scale at the primary level and creates a sort of, you know, significant and monumental gesture, which is the cleft. And this elevation, I think, also in this image allows you to appreciate, or us all to appreciate, the refinement of proportions and the kind of gridded facade. There's a change, as Mr. Flipper explained, in the proportions that shut off the building. We can be clear about the similar points with Paul in this. I think actually the slide even more so demonstrates the enhancement to the setting itself by the introduction of building more complementary nature and character, and no impact really at all on the ability to admire and appreciate the entablature, which is such a self-interested feature. And so again, you saw it previously, but this was a test view we ran because Mr. Forshore had asked about view and conservation area appraisal, which were formally identified as an indicative view. So we decided on that there is no visibility above the entablishment material impact along there. This is as good a slide as any, sir. I think just to say a few words about Selfridges and why I formed the judgment I think the setting relationship is entirely acceptable. And Mr. Harris has sort of foreshadowed a lot of this. The really remarkable thing about Selfridges in an English context is just how self-conscious when I say is how American it is, actually. I mean, Stanley Barton's a great figure in the history of architecture. The Chicago plan, responsible for a lot of the redevelopment of Chicago after the war. And one of those figures venerated like Louis Sullivan, really, in the canon of American architecture. A big, bold, gutsy fellow with great ambition, ran an amazing office, actually. Incredibly talented people, which carried on over time. And of course, what they brought to the site was not just what we call now Beaux-Arts classicism, which is because so many Americans went to called Beaux-Arts, but also an advanced building technique. Now, it's not the first steel frame of its kind in London. We have the Ritz, which is quite early. A lot of Kingsway is redeveloped in steel frames at this period, but certainly it was done very rapidly and efficiently, according to reports at the time, because it was done using an American contractor. And maybe even worse for some people, the engineer was a Swedish-American engineer, Bylander, who wound up settling in the UK. So it is, Mr. Harris says, a bit of Chicago transplanted to here. But what's interesting historically, of course, is that Selfridge cut his teeth in retail in Marshall Field in Chicago. So Waring and Gillow, who occupied the site, wanted to expand and do so in a bold, brave way. And they went to America to get someone who was responsible for department stores. And department stores in New York and Chicago were just emporia. And the concept that was brought here was shopping as an experience. An elegant, sort of international, that's very much the message here. I've mentioned already, sir, how there was this interest in the late 19th century in America in using classical architecture in a way that reflected the steel construction. So it is an example of that. The frame is self-supporting. The external facade is self-supporting. It takes rigidity from the frame behind. It's reliant on carrying itself. And that's true of the cast iron window, the iron window insets as well. So it is modern ideas translated into what was a modern French language. In terms of scale and context, sir, here, one of the images that I did annotate to help find the site, you see there are precedents for buildings of G+9 across different parts of Oxford Street. It's a short point, Mr. Pilber has already made it. And Mr. Pilber has already showed you some of these images here. And you can look at these in your own conscious of time. But, you know, certainly in the vicinity of the site, there's Park House, G+9. Of course, it slopes down, it's at a lower level, that's worth noting. But also G+8, 4.6 Oxford Street. And then other department stores. Oh, actually, sir, a slide we haven't looked at, actually, but it comes from the City Council's district framework again. And a series of planning and policies for this area. But what it does, quite helpfully, I think, and accurately, is divides Oxford Street into 3 parts. And there is a definite difference in character in the west part of Oxford Street and its function because of its position really between 2 tube stations, Bond Street and Marble Arch. And I think really because of the extent of large format plots that exist in this location. And so that further up in the central part of the Oxford Circus towards that part of Oxford Street, you have some of these new developments as developers already talked about, achieving some similar scales and so forth. Finally, sir, in terms of Selfridges, point. So in summary, and I've trailed this point there, I think that Selfridges is such a powerful building. 150 odd meters on the facade. it occupies the whole of the city block in returns, quite a significant way. It has a heavily modeled facade. It's a building that can sustain a lot of change in its setting. There's no designed relationship, in my opinion, as between Orchard House and it. I know there are different opinions about that. I accept there's some affinity, but to the extent that it's meaningful, it only to my eye demonstrates why Selfridge is such a fantastic building. And I think in many respects, the proposals enhance the setting of Selfridge, both in terms of the immediate townscape, but also in terms of the way they integrate the rest of Selfridge. Great. Much more rapidly, sir, I'm going to deal with the conservation areas. Really useful slide. Sir Oxford Street is interesting at this park because it's basically two great estates putting onto it. It's Grosvenor to the south, and Portman to the north. I'll start with the later one, Portman, because we abut the Portman estate. Why is it interesting? Well, it's developed starting in about the mid-18th century by the estate around a series of plant squares. So it's Portman Square in the southern half is earlier. And then that town planning grid is run up north, east, and west. And Manchester Square dates from similar period. And the linking spine is really Morgan Street. And over time, then, the estate developed further north and into the early 19th century. And they two rather unusual square, I think unique in London, Bryanston Square and Montague Place or Square, I can't remember now, but long rectangular squares. So in the north part of the conservation area, there's a great deal of historic fabric that survives. There's been amalgamation of plots and infill. There's a lot of Georgian housing, late Georgian housing stock there still. It has all the characteristics of fine Georgian estate in terms of hierarchy of streets, spaces, muse blocks, and so forth. More residential to the north, the central part, some commercial infill. Now, as you get to the south, the character changes quite significantly because of the proximity of Oxford Street. And you see, sir, included within the conservation area are those three big blocks to the southwest corner that Lyons developed in the 1920s and 30s, omitting the block that we're talking about as far as its associated block. And in the southern half, so the commercials, the uses are more commercial, and there's some very large commercial buildings, which the estate gave leases for in the early 1920s, developed in the neo-Georgian style. And all of that larger grain commercial development, I think, features very much in your experience. And the bit of the conservation area that is right at the back of the site is somewhat fragmented relative to the rest of it. There's been a lot of infill development, there's been a lot of modern development. You saw, sir, the condition of a number of the buildings is poor in places, and you have some uses that are, I forget what to tell you. And so this is, I think, a key view for us in relation to Portland State Conservation Area. The state is Hesketh House there from the early 1920s by Messrs. Joseph, the commercial residential modest development in Westminster. I think the interesting point here, sir, is the interval that you have as you look south. So there's Hesketh House, there's Recess, there's the M&S 1970s building, and then there's Orchard House. So there's three gaps, and it's kind of welcome, really, because Hesketh House is quite a significant, I think, building. And I think what's interesting about the scheme is it preserves that sense of interval as you move from south to north. And the inflection here, I think, is particularly helpful. I think it draws the eye to the end of the street in a way which is satisfying. And critically, I think that the oversailing cornice, really strong line, taken together with the northern parts of the boat, that knits Hesketh House into an urban block. And again, creates a more cohesive townscape, the word I used earlier to describe some of these benefits. And there is, of course, I think it's agreed, sir, a direct benefit to the conservation area by the and its setting by removal of the link block there. And likewise by the reinstatement of the south end of Hesketh House, which is identified as a building of merit in the conservation area. And I think the parties agree that some weight should be attached to that improvement to designated heritage asset, which is the conservation area. And the additional benefit, sir, that comes from making that link open to the sky again, because Granville Place is a historic street where the development reinstates some historic grain in the area, which I think is a point worth or makes it more evident. Anyway. And then Bryanston Street. Now, this is an image I know that Mr. Forshaw has written about and expressed some concern about. The list of building we're dealing with, sir, here is the one in the middle ground. We pointed that out to you yesterday. That was a rendered painted building, grade 2 listed. You see, sir, it's experience already in the context of bigger buildings. Obviously, sir, we're developing something which is much bigger than what's there at the moment. The lower parts of the development have that light facing, which I think provide a more appropriate backdrop to the terrace house. And then the upper parts in contrasting color, I think introduces a scale and modulation that makes the relationship acceptable. Of course, bearing in mind, sir, that the listed building is associated with the street, which is a major North Francis street. So you're kind of aware all the time you're butting up against Oxford Street and some of the big buildings in the Portland estate. This is the other view I think Mr. Forshaw has expressed concern about. Again, similar points, obviously a very significant increase in scale. I think the glazing at the end of the street, the use of masonry, pulling that back to the north side of the street visually in the sight line. Obviously, there's a change in the way you appreciate the skyline profile of terrace, but the terrace is a pretty substantial Italianate building, consistent in its scale and its use. And as you walk into the area, obviously the existing buildings, poor qualities are evident, and one becomes less aware naturally of the height of the building and more aware of the landscape improvements. The acceptable relationship. Early on, sir, we were very keen to understand whether there was any interchangeability with with Portman Square or Manchester Square. And there isn't. Here's a red line to prove it. Question was raised, I think, in Mr. Forshaw's evidence about any overtopping from the square in views from the northeast, and actually included in the HTVIA, sir, there were model shots
Hey, baby.
of this kind that, and I zoom in on it now, that demonstrated there was no meaningful visibility above buildings on the square.
Thank you. How are you doing?
Almost done. Nathan, finally. And sir, very simply, the grid neighborhood laid out largely around two squares, Grosvenor, Barclay Square.
Not did anything today.
Sorry.
That's your fault.
Yeah.
They're muted.
They've muted themselves.
Yeah, all Grosvenor lands are laid out around two squares. And therefore having rough division around the center between north Grosvenor Square sets the grid, south Barclay Square. Even earlier, this estate development, the Portland estate starts in 1710, thereabouts. And remarkably by 1750 or so, it's completely developed in the sort of normal Georgian way, high survival of original fabric. But interesting, sir, and relevant to this case that in the late 19th century, as the leases fell due, the newly created Duke of Westminster, the first Duke of Westminster, who was ceded to the title and was created actually in 1870, they embarked on a really ambitious estate program of redevelopment using what was then, modern architecture. So, the arts and crafts movement, the aesthetic movement, and so you have a wonderful collection, really, of buildings from the late 19th century that sort of overlays and sits within this matrix of American Embassy site that I have some involvement with historically. We tried, sir, we understood from the beginning North Ortley Street tested, and we keen to understand any interaction with Grosvenor. So we did a sequence of views from north and south, and looked at some of those with no visibility from Grosvenor Square. And the building would become visible on the far side of Oxford Street. And here also you see probably the point that is the maximum visibility of setback stories. And I think about this, sir, I just sort of offer that as you approach Oxford Street from North Ortley Street, you are aware of Oxford Street and of Park House. And it's what you're appreciating, I think, in this view is that it's something in the distance beyond. And I think, therefore, the effect that you're seeing here isn't going to be intrusive. It has a degree of legibility and meaning in the context of the structure of London, and also reflecting the importance of Oxford Street in the overall hierarchy of London's functioning as well. And when you get nearer, we've seen this already, I'll skip it. We tested an intermediate view that Mr. Forshaw asked us about on the piece of paving that's in the deck, sir, I think. by the time you get into the middle of North Alton Street, actually the skyline of the building reduces below that Park Street. I don't think that there was any reasonable basis to think it was harmful impact. Additional heritage assets, sir, we looked at yesterday. I've just circled them on this plan so you can see where they are, and this is an acquired document. One of them is listed. You see this little tiny 29 there, the leftmost one.
Okay.
Yeah, and the other, and then the second one is listed in North Alton Street, it's on Sperity Building we looked at yesterday. And then the three NDAs that Mr. Fortos expressed some concern about are circled, actually 7 to 9, Portland Street, just south of number 29. But we didn't identify them, sir, as I said on the initial designated plan, because it was a designated asset plan. And here they are, we saw them, so listed, not listed, getting some information about this already. North Alton Street, a really good example of this late 19th century redevelopment. Auspices. Again, commented on this already, just identifying them for your assistance, sir. I think actually the improvement to the setting of this part of the conservation area is going to be really significant because we're all of us there at the moment. Sir, I think both Mr. Forshaw and I were wrong yesterday to say this was listed. It's not listed. It's an NVHA. It's a building of merit in the conservation area. I think because of the pub and the likely fact that a lot of the fabric will be open. You can just tell by the proportions of the building. But it's a really fine, it's a really pleasant pub interior. So, and we've already talked about Nestle House. Square. So in summary, sir, in terms of direct impacts, obviously the demolition of the NBA removes all of its significance. That harm is not weighted harm. You're familiar with that. And the presumption against the cause of that harm, etc. So that is the impact we're talking about. In terms of Selfridges and Stratford Place, I've identified a really significant enhancement to the setting as a consequence of the public realm works and architecture of high quality that is responsive and I think creates a more cohesive setting for the building. In terms of Portland Square, I've likewise identified some enhancements. They're local. I'm particularly looking along Orchard Street. I think that's a really strong point, but also the functionality of that conservation area by public realm works and the reconnecting at full height of the street. And as for the Mayfair conservation area, sir, my findings are no harmful impact at all. So no harm, no benefit. So that's my evidence achieved.
Thank you very much. And no further questions from me.
Thank you very much. Then we'll adjourn until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Just before we, sorry.
No, just one small point. So, one of the officers raised to me the fact that the two basements aren't included in the description of development. Obviously, they've been they're in the plans. They've included in the original certificate have been, from our point of view, no prejudice caused by canvas the point of both other parties, and they're the same view. So, just the technicality.
Thank you. Can you slot a little paragraph and send it on ground?
Yes.
We will certainly do that. So I was just going to bring you up to date in relation to the potential round table.
Indeed.
Can I just say, I think very good progress has been made to the extent that there is now a much better understanding of where the various factual matters lie, which is good. I don't think we're yet at a position to say that it will definitely be a round table and it should definitely be tomorrow. I need to discuss this with my learned friend.
Okay.
I haven't been able to do that, but I just wanted to let you know that things are moving in the right direction. It wouldn't be the end of the world if we finished this witness tomorrow and dealt with section 106 and conditions, because you asked us to do that this week.
Indeed.
With a view to, if there is the need for a round table, for that being pushed back a little. I haven't discussed it with my learned friend, but I just wanted to let you know that things were moving constructively.
Well, timing wise, we're doing fine.
We're doing fine.
I think officer availability for condition sessions okay on Friday. You can write and say, but if we were to discuss the obligation, the solicitor's only available next week. So just in case.
So maybe it would be better to do it first on Tuesday.
Yes, that might do it.
Lovely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The inquiry is adjourned.
Okay.